transitioning into our next piece, and I know one of the topics that we mentioned a lot about is the cookieless world, right? How can SMBs compete and win in a cookieless world? So with this session, I wanted to bring in Alex Cohn from IAB and Udain Bose, our CEO and founder here at NetElixir. Quick, just a background on Alex, so we understand his background. Prior to IAB, Alex was the director of product management at Xandr, and he was directly responsible for the privacy and the creative product behind it, the engineering plans, and overall the execution and go-to-market between everything there. So, Alex is very knowledgeable on this topic. So this is why we really want to bring Alex, Udain into this picture to have a live Q&A session, but overall just a discussion about why this is so important, especially going into 2022. So with that, Alex and Udain, I'd love to bring you guys on.
Thank you, Marv. Hey, Alex.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you, Alex. Too.
I know it has been a fascinating day so far. I mean, we started with Professor Jerry Wind, and then we had Natalie give an amazing, insightful presentation, and then we had the mind-blowing magic show. And now we had the amazing David Bell. Wow, David, I'll never forget the Edmund, never ever. So that's amazing. So Alex, I think before we kickstart our discussion, I would love for you to really just quickly self-introduce yourself maybe, and a little bit about IABTech Lab as well. What is the sort of work, and just a little bit about IABTech Lab.
Of course. I know this audience may not be super familiar with what we do, but IABTech Lab is really focused on creating standards for interoperability in the digital advertising sort of ecosystem. So we relate that oftentimes to standards that people know outside of digital advertising, like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. You know, if those things weren't there as underlying technologies, a lot of the products that are built on top of them wouldn't have flourished the way that they have, because there's not this stable sort of underlying standard state. We do the same sort of thing for digital advertising ecosystem. So that's a little bit about IABTech Lab. Personally, thanks for the introduction. I came at this topic of sort of what I call the intersection of privacy and identity and a lot of different commercial concerns, be it brands, be it publishers where ads are getting served, and the technologies in between. I started really focusing in on this just over about 4 years ago and got super intrigued by this issue space, and it's only grown in importance. So I guess I picked a good issue to like dig deep on. But yeah, I've got experience sort of on the technology side. I've been a product manager for a long time now, and been working at sort of the center of this, again, collision of privacy concerns that are disrupting identity and how we do things like measurement and attribution and targeting in this space. So it's been a fun time to be me. I get to do this a lot, which is really great. I'm really excited to actually get to talk to like SMB marketers today, which is not my typical audience. So glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Fantastic, Alex. Great to have you here. I know. I mean, you mentioned SMB. I think we have as of last count probably more than 400 SMBs joined this session.
Amazing.
And I think just in a very simplistic manner, I think I discussed with you when we last spoke, which was a couple of months back when you were in that mountain house, that lovely mountain house in upstate New York. But I said that, Alex, I mean, one of the observations we have is probably about 80% of the SMBs are still figuring out as to what is really is the cookieless world, and how exactly will they be impacted. So it'll be really helpful if you can explain in very simplistic terms for everyone as to what is going on.
Yeah, the most simplistic way I figured out how to explain it, and hopefully this is simple to understand, is the connection between an advertiser's audience or brand's audience and where they want to show an ad to that audience, right, on a piece of content like a publisher's site or app or whatever experience that's showing an ad. So that the connection that has been there to link up what a brand knows about an audience or me, right? So I shop at a lot of different brands, or I might be a prospective person who is going to buy something from one of the SMB marketers here. How does a machine connect me on brand A's website to where I see an ad on publisher one's website? That has traditionally been cookies, third-party cookies. Without needing to understand what third-party cookies are, they're literally just a mechanism to understand that me on my web browser, I'm the same person or the same entity on that browser in one place as I am in another. And that linkage is breaking. So I think the thing to know is that means, when you want to control how many times you might show a given ad to a person across different sites, that's going to be harder to do at scale. Doing attribution, because I might see, and interact with some sort of ad experience in one site and then go take an action somewhere else. The ability to make that linkage is really what is breaking with the loss of the third-party cookie, or at least it's breaking from the ubiquitous way that most companies pulled off that connection kind of under the hood. So it's really a breakage in this linking of audiences. The bigger picture, to think about is, why is this happening? People are concerned about their privacy, is their the data wake that they leave, is it being protected? And it's important to note that that's not just consumer, your users, consumers, people buying your products, right? They don't just think about privacy as it relates to web browsers, which is where third-party cookies were the ID linkage. They think about it elsewhere too. So on mobile phones, where there aren't cookies, but there's still concern over my privacy. So the bigger picture is we're all kind of talking about third-party cookies and the disruption that removing those creates. But the impetus to that really has been, consumer concerns around privacy that both governments and regulators are reacting to, as well as the major huge platforms like Google and Apple, who are all over the news right now for sort of what their changes may be doing to marketing. So that's how I explain it when I talk to folks. It's just that the connection between an audience that is presumed to be an advertisers and an audience that's presumed to be publishers, where you might see an ad, that linkage being broken.
Understood. That's extremely well explained. What is it getting replaced with? I mean, I know it's getting broken, but what is the future? I mean, what is the alternative?
Yeah, well, right now, a lot of different things. So we've been saying this in our own presentations, there's no real silver bullet at this point. The platforms who are sort of taking away, so you've got Google Chrome, who made the announcement about it's deprecating third-party cookies. It was really the last web browser to do so, or to say that they were going to do so. They haven't done it yet. But they also have 65% market share globally of web browser traffic. So people paid attention, right? When Google announced that, they said, well, we realize that's going to disrupt a lot of things. How advertiser outcomes happen, at least for paid digital on web. And they've been creating some proposals they're mitigating to some degree. I think the best way to understand the proposals that they're creating, at least, is keeping what's known about a linkage between an advertiser's sort of audience and where an ad might be shown to a user and that publisher's audience, that linkage happening in the browser. And in the same way, outside of the third-party cookie landscape on mobile devices, you probably are all heard about some of the changes Apple's making in iOS 14, which I think we're going to talk about in a second. But they're developing similar mitigating, I guess, APIs, but interfaces for technology companies to plug into. In the case of Apple, they've built something for conversion tracking, but the point is, though, what's replacing it, a lot of different things that are going to be a bit fragmented. So it's besides just knowing what's changing, it's now going to become like a time where figuring out of all those things that might be semi-replacements for different outcomes that you had before, figuring out which ones of those work and which ones of those you're going to invest in, you know, and what capabilities you're going to look for in the technologies that you pick will be somewhat predicated on which of those different tools that Chrome's building, that that Apple iOS is building, et cetera, like which ones of those kind of work for your outcomes. But the summary is it's going to be fragmented for a bit, because what we're seeing is a fracturing of how these connections are made that have enabled, you know, things from frequency capping to targeting to attribution at scale. That scale is going away with the loss of third-party cookies, with the loss of the IDFA and in general, and the iOS ecosystem. So to be able to achieve those outcomes, you're gonna have to use a bunch of different tools now. So it may not be the best news in the world, but it is the facts as they are at the moment. It will be interesting to see, I guess, you know, what companies really thrive in adapting to this new kind of landscape.
Very interesting, Alex. So essentially the impact for the marketer would be what? How exactly will the marketer get impacted?
Yeah. So you know, marketers have a lot of different channels and strategies. So with regard to cookies, your paid web and sort of cross-channel analytics, I think, are going to be the most impacted by the loss or the deprecation of the third-party cookie. Well, what does that mean in paid web? What are the specific impacts? The outcomes that identifiers like the third-party cookie enable is, like, if I'm running a paid sort of web campaign and I want to control the frequency that one individual browser user, you know, how often they see an ad in a given day, and not blow my budget on that, that actually isn't going to be possible at scale anymore. Across sort of the open web, it will be possible in certain pockets. So like if you are doing most of your buys on paid web through, and most of them are happening on sort of singular properties like a Facebook or like Google's properties or even Amazon, you can control frequency within that scope of domain. But really what's being, I guess, kind of attacked here is the concept of being able to persistently kind of identify a browser across domains. So, you know, if your funnel is, you know, seeing an advertisement in one place and jumping out to take an action somewhere else, that connection, at least at scale, is being broken. So the impact of that is, like, I think fragmentation, I used that word earlier, but some fragmentation in analytics in terms of where you're able to go to see you know, how you know, paid media campaigns are working, is going to be a really big one probably for this audience. And then just like in general, you know, spending wisely, right? Like part of targeting, and you know, Facebook gets a really bad rap, and I'm sure everyone has their own opinion about Facebook. Facebook did a marketing campaign kind of in response to Apple's changes. Now, it's very self-interested, but at the same time, it's true. They're saying for small and, you know, medium-sized brands, especially ones that are startups and mostly digital, direct-to-consumer, the ability to just spend your money where it's performing, where performance is judged by an action you take somewhere outside of Facebook, that's going to be really difficult now to measure. So it's like, I think there's going to be a whole lot of impacts. Now, it depends on what the outcomes are you're looking for. So like, I realize not all marketers are made the same. One last thought here on this question of impacts on marketing. I mentioned paid web and cross-channel analytics sort of as a general area that's affected. I think 2 days ago, Apple announced a feature about basically, you know, thwarting the ability to track email opens and email clicks. So like, email marketing as well is something that's now being, I guess, kind of come into the crosshairs of at least Apple. So yeah, there's a lot to pay attention to right now in terms of impacts on your marketing efforts. It's a great time to lean into smart, you know, I guess agencies who are looking at this stuff at scale, like across a bunch of different brands. That's one thing I would note there is like, you're going to need some help.
Yeah. It's a very interesting time, actually, Alex. So 2 questions from this. The first one, from what you are mentioning, essentially, you're talking about this concept of a walled garden, right? So you have to work within the walled gardens of Google or Facebook or Amazon or whatever it is. And you really have to do exceptionally well within that walled garden, right? And effectively, I think just by a principle of, let us say, almost like an deduction, I mean, understandably, the bigger players have an advantage because they'll be able to drive a much bigger mass compared to, let us say, some of the smaller channels. So understandably, there may be a bit of a migration as well, probably, I don't know. So that's, I think, so my question is, how big of a threat is it for the smaller channels? Or is it going to shift the budgets away effectively from them and really localize it or give a lot of power to the larger ones is my first question. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the power dynamics have always, you know, big and small are still going to be the big and small relatively, right? Like Google being big, channel, it's funny to say this, but like relative to Google's property as a channel, like just buying, you know, advertisements potentially on something like Reddit or weather.com, right? Like they're going to have a hard time, I think, convincing, well, where people are using an agency to place their dollars, they're going to have a hard time convincing agencies to focus on all the legwork that they're going to have to do to sort of buy in a fragmented way.
Yeah.
And that's naming like a few really big channels. I mean, or at least properties, I guess, where you might, you know, find your audience that are somewhat ubiquitous to a lot of different types of, you know, potential consumers. Yeah, I mean, it will be interesting to see. Like, I think what to watch is, again, back to these mitigating things that Google and Apple are putting in the place of things like third-party cookies or device identifiers in the case of Apple and iOS. You know, theoretically, those should allow folks that are marketers that are spending money on these channels that are not just within the walled gardens to actually get some of the same outcomes across buying across, you know, the open web or a bunch of different apps in the iOS ecosystem. It's hard to say whether or not that will actually happen because all of these things are very theoretical right now. So these shifts are happening before there's actually something that's been tested and proven to replace them. So in theory, at least some of the major, you know, what I would call like happy path outcomes for marketers should have some replacements coming. Very few of those things have been tested at scale. Many of you probably read about in the news something that Google's calling Flock, which is sort of just the way to think about it is they're creating audiences in the browser of like behavior in browsing, which means that a brand like a marketer may want to try and test, you know, against, you know, test their marketing budgets, at least in paid web, against those sort of browsing behaviors that have been aggregated by the browser and kind of represented to an end user or to a buyer in like ID form. Somewhat complicated to explain, I know. But that stuff is just in what's called origin trial, which means like it's just a percentage of Chrome traffic right now, and then on top of that, just a handful of companies that might be testing out, well, how could this work? So it's a little bit nerve-wracking, I think, for people right now to think about, okay, this stuff's going away. There's supposed to be replacements, but I haven't been able to test the replacements yet. So it's a big coordination problem. The last thing I'll say about this too is like, even if those mitigating sort of features that Google and Apple are proposing as replacements to things like the third-party cookie or the IDFA, even if they work from an outcome standpoint, the power dynamics of who's designing those sort of tools that a browser's offering or that iOS is offering, the question is how are those things going to respond to market demands, right? So if, if I'm an SMB marketer and I want new features, who do I go talk to? Do I go talk to a web browser? Do I go talk to Apple? More than likely, you're not going to get Chrome on the phone. You're not going to get Mozilla on the phone. You're not going to get, Apple on the phone. Certainly, they're notoriously the hardest company probably in the world to get on a phone. So like, what is the incentive, I guess, of the product and engineering teams at Apple iOS and at Google Chrome to really meet the market's demands that will continue to evolve, right? Because marketers want to try new things. Marketers have new ideas. Will these APIs be responsive to that? TBD. I've actually asked the Chrome team that directly, and they've not provided a really great answer other than like, we're trying. So yeah.
Do you have any
answer to that question?
No, I think
about this stuff probably in my sleep.
So one of the things about this IDFA and the iOS 14.5 and so on, I think is you mentioned about what is the impact going to be on the email service providers? Because I know we have quite of our friends who run the ESP business. Like we have friends from Listrac, Klaviyo, Sendlane, and so on, joining this call. So what is, again, it's probably too early, maybe just 2 days of less than 48 hours. But what are the initial impressions? What is the initial response?
I mean, you're right on it being sort of, in a way, the biggest announcements have been early. I'd come back to one of the things I said on your first question, which is bigger picture. What is inspiring Apple to make these changes? What is inspiring Google to make these changes and other, major platforms? And it's responding to this zeitgeist right now of, hey, I feel like I don't know what's happening with my data, and I don't feel like I'm in any kind of control over that. And in as much as that is true, you have a lot of engineers now at these platforms thinking about, well, how do we respond to that? And a lot of them have come up with every potential way to maybe surreptitiously track a user across the internet, track Alex tcone@gmail.com across the internet. And email is a huge like opportunity to know who I am across sort of devices. So there's two facets of email happening here that I think are interesting for sort of the email service provider or email provider like services out there. One is email obfuscation. So sign in with Apple is like basically obfuscating a user's email. Google actually has a proposal to do the same thing in Chrome. It's called Web ID. So there's that factor. And then there's the measurement factor of like when which is what the bigger, I guess, announcement was this week from Apple. When an email loads, I guess in an Apple email sort of system, them trying to find the image pixels, basically the track opens, track clicks, and stop those from being able to, make calls out to do that. Like, I don't know, like that. It's some point I feel like a lot of brands and public, like big media companies for that matter, are going to say, wait a second, why are you disintermediating me from my, who I have a relationship with, the user, Alex tcone@gmail.com, right? I've now given you my email twice. I shouldn't do that. But anyway, but yeah, like, I think there's going to be pushback from major brands. I think there's going to be push because they're affected too, right? So Yeah, it's a little early to say how widely this will spread, what Apple is doing. But if you go back to the principles that they're attacking sort of in, what I call the zeitgeist of like real user concerns about what's happening with my data, I think you can expect, Google's Android platform to maybe do similar things as iOS, maybe in a different way, but same sort of outcomes. And I think email in general is becoming more and more in the crosshairs. Now, again, email means a bunch of different things, but just thinking about what those engineers are sort of after when they roll out these new features that are supposed to be protective, like is a good way to predict the future in terms of like, well, does it seem like a privacy engineer would come after this practice? Chances are, if you answer yes, like they've probably thought of coming after this practice.
It's an interesting time, Alex. I mean, but one of the things, I mean, when these companies are announcing new changes, let us say Apple's new changes and so on, it can be fairly safely mentioned that these are irreversible, right? I don't think they're going to be reversing them anytime soon. But who knows? Exactly. And the reason I think that supposition is there primarily because all of this concerns privacy. Now, privacy is a much stronger, bigger overall purpose compared to the individual advertisers or let us say agencies. Really. So that's what my concern is, that we really have to accept the fact that this change is unidirectional. And I think the chances of it getting sort of reversed is probably less. So my final question is, what exactly are IABTech doing to go ahead and educate everyone? And do you guys see this as a net negative, or is it a net positive? How would you see this?
Yeah, good question. I'll try to be brief, knowing that we have 2 minutes. Our reaction to this, and I mean, we're decently public. I can speak for Tech Lab. The IAB, for what it's worth, is sort of a franchise name. So I can speak for IABTech Lab. Our view of this is that the status quo of how a lot of this audience linkage was happening in digital advertising could definitely use some reform. Adding controls, especially like thinking it just about, brands and publishers where ads are being served, right? Like giving them controls over where data is going to is really important. Giving users control is important. And to be able to do that, you kind of have to reform the underlying tech so that you can more or less sandbox it, to steal a term from Google. So generally, we're supportive of the direction of like, we need to reform. I think, to your point on irreversible, our posture on this is the direction of travel. The question is there multiple ways to travel? Are there multiple ways to travel? And our answer is yes. We think that there is a possibility to balance commercial interests in advertising, digital advertising, marketing, like with consumer and regulatory privacy and data protection demands. Like, it is possible. And I think what we're trying to do is, or at least from the Tech Lab standards side, is we're trying to actually develop some underlying standards to create more opportunity for those controls to be there, like in a ubiquitous fashion, so that we have a better story for digital advertising on, why this isn't the wild, wild west, and why you actually can control, companies' ability to, measure outcomes on you as sort of an individual browser user or iPhone user. So I think, yes, it's unidirectional, but the direction, if you think about, could be adjusted. And that's really based on education too, is the more people who understand what's happening and can weigh in on wait, hold on, there are different ways to go approach this problem. I think that will be great. So I love speaking at things like this for that reason, because more people knowing what's going on is great.
Thank you. Fantastic, Alex. I think it really has been a pleasure having you on this one.
Thanks for having me.
2 months back, and so much has really happened in those 2 months, right? It's crazy, just absolutely crazy stuff. But thank you very much, my friend, for really joining us on this one. And any questions for Alex? I am pretty sure he's one of the most accessible and the nicest human beings that you can meet. So I am pretty sure all the SMBs specifically joining in, if you have any questions, direct it to us and we'll definitely discuss with Alex and get back to you. But thank you very much, Alex. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.